Welcome everyone to the Andrew W. Mellon lecture, The Refugee Crisis, Crossing, Cutting, Burning the Mediterranean Seametery. My name is Berit Ebert. I'm the Vice President of Programs here at the American Academy in Berlin, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's lecture by Hakim Abderrezak. Hakim is our Andrew W. Mellon Fellow in the Humanities this spring, and this lecture, as well as his whole fellowship, wouldn't have been possible without the generous support of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, for which we are extremely grateful. They have enabled us to have 6 outstanding scholars here over the course of the past 3 years. We're extremely happy that Hakim and Leila Amine, our Mellon Fellow from the last semester, will return to the Academy in June 2020 and conduct a joint week-long workshop on the topic of immobilities, new directions in the humanities, which will also be supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Before we get to the main part, let me briefly explain to you the Zoom etiquette of tonight. So we have a Zoom webinar after our introductions and Hakim's presentation. You will have a chance to ask questions, and you have the Q&A function on the top, bottom of your screen. You can type in your questions and we will read them out and try to address as many as possible. The raise your hand function will not be enabled. So you can use it, but nothing will happen. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the second important participant of tonight's program, Professor Valérie Orlando. She is joining us from France today, and she's just the perfect person to introduce Hakim. I just learned that they've known each other for 15 years by now. So this was still when Hakim was, at least in academic terms, a small kid. And she has ever since followed his work. And it was just wonderful to see how they interact. When we had this preparatory session, she referred to him as a tragedy. When he and she were discussing whether she would stay on and watch his lecture via a screen, he was like, no, go, it's fine. So you really see a very special relationship here. Anyway, Valérie is a professor of French and Francophone literatures at the University of Maryland in College Park, and she is the recipient of the Fulbright Tocqueville Distinguished Chair Award. And she was also a research fellow at the Collegium de Lyon. Her most recent books, and I only refer to the most recent ones, the list is much, much longer, include the Algerian new novel, The Poetics of a Modern Nation, 1915 to 1971, as well as New African Cinema, both were published in 2017, and Screening Morocco, Contemporary Film in a Changing Society, published in 2011. Together with Cécile Asselien, she has published Teaching Haiti, Strategy for Creating New Narratives in very, very recently in 2021, and with Pamela Pears, Paris and the Marginalized Author, Treachery, Alienation, Queerness and Exile in 2018. With Sandra M. Cyprus, she published Reimagining the Caribbean, Conversations among the Creole, English, French, and Spanish Caribbean, and this was published in 2014. Since 2004, she has worked as series editor for After the Empire, The Francophone World, and Post-Colonial France with Lexington Books. Valérie, it's a great honor to have you here with us and a true pleasure. It was the introduction, or the introductory session was most promising, and we really look forward to both you and Hakim. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me to present Hakim's work, who, like you said, I've followed for many years, and we've been friends and colleagues and had great intellectual exchanges now for, at least 15 years. So I'm going to read a short introduction that really doesn't do justice to Hakim, but I'm going to try. Hakim Abderrezak teaches in the Department of French and Italian at the University of Minnesota, where he is affiliated with several programs, departments, centers, and institutes. Hakim was a visiting scholar at the Center for Near and Middle Eastern Studies and a visiting professor in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures at Philipps Universität Marburg, Germany. He completed his master's degree in France in American literature and wrote his thesis on 19th century author Nathaniel Hawthorne's Tales. This was followed by a PhD in French studies at Northwestern University. He began his academic career by writing about and publishing on Francophone and Arabophone Maghrebi cinema and literature. Since the mid-2000s, he has focused on the Mediterranean because, as he's explained to me, first he wanted to examine how the place of France and the French language were becoming increasingly marginal or simply less exclusive in the works of writers, filmmakers, and singers hailing from North Africa. And second, because he began researching narratives about forced or failed attempts at crossing the Mediterranean Sea. In other words, he has become a comparatist, working with primary and secondary sources published in a wide range of countries and languages, such as French, Arabic, Spanish, Italian, and Berber. Since the late 2000s, Hakim has published extensively on clandestine migrations across the Mediterranean, mostly on how the cinematic, literary, and musical realms have treated the tragedy of illegal crossings, but also on the political and media coverage that has become a world phenomenon. In 2013, he organized the first US-based international conference on this topic, bringing together eminent scholars from a diverse set of disciplines in the humanities and social sciences. And I have to say, I was honored to be among these academics for Burning the Sea Symposium at the University of Minnesota. In 2016, his book, Eccentric Migrations, Europe and the Maghreb in Mediterranean Cinema, Literature, and Music was published. Eccentric Migrations is the first academic book-length study in the humanities in English, dealing with clandestine migration. It continues to be a reference. I've read it and had my own students read it in my classes. And also it's a reference for others, I'm sure other scholars in the audience in the humanities working on forced migration in a diverse set of departments, fields, and disciplines. Indeed, Hakim's work is genuinely interdisciplinary and at the interface of the humanities and social sciences, resonating with peers in a wide range of domains. The volume he co-edited for Expression Maghrébine also proposed an original perspective by being the first journal issue to address literary works produced in and about the Maghreb in languages other than French and Arabic. It thus helped revisit our understanding of Maghrebi literature, which is commonly conceived as being either Anglophone or Francophone. His numerous essays and articles have appeared in several volumes in journals in the US, the UK, France, and Germany, including the American Academy's Berlin Journal. Hakim also paints, and I just learned this. This is something that we share. We're both dealing often in art. And he tells me that he is continually drawn to art, which has accompanied his thinking, research, and writing for over 15 years now. At the American Academy, he has been working both on his manuscript entitled Burning the Sea, Clandestine Crossings in the Mediterranean Seametery, and on a series of paintings, which he hopes to complete in the next few weeks. He paints because this medium allows him to express his own take on the global issue of migration, and perhaps also because there are things that are better conveyed through art. In the words of American painter Edward Hopper, if you can't talk about it, why paint it? As his presentation will demonstrate, language can be incomplete or erroneous, or in the worst case scenario, one-sided and even outright false. He has he has felt the need to paint the same way he has felt the need to write about what we have come to call the refugee crisis. As he explains in the introduction of his first book, when he was a teenager himself, he witnessed Moroccan children and teenagers trying in vain to cross over to Europe, and thus he was left with an indelible memory of the shattered dreams and hardships of these migrant hopefuls. It's with my great love for Hakim and his work that I introduce him today. And the title of his talk is The Refugee Crisis, Crossing, Cutting, and Burning the Mediterranean Seametery.
Thank you, Valerie, for your very generous introduction. It is a great pleasure and honor to be introduced by such an inspiring, world-renowned scholar and a pioneer and leading figure in Maghreb studies. So thank you very much. I would also like to thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for funding my fellowship, and the American Academy in Berlin for having me, the selection committee for selecting my dossier, the management and staff for making this fellowship a rich and productive opportunity in spite of the current circumstances. And I would like to thank my fellow fellows for their camaraderie. Last but not least, a special thanks to Berit, Johanna, Caitlin, Renee, and Matthias for going out of their way to help me undertake my artistic practice in Berlin. And of course, thanks to Lutz and Reinhold for making every day a pleasant day, and many other people at the Academy whom I don't have the time to mention. Let me start with a video clip. What we have just watched is an excerpt from a film shot in Spain and Morocco, and in between in the Strait of Gibraltar, where thousands of migrants perished in their attempts to reach Europe in dinghies and fishing boats well before these local tragedies became a global issue. A little less than a decade ago, when trans-Mediterranean crossings finally made it onto the world's radar. Now, I would like to show a couple of maps. So here's a map of the Mediterranean basin, and a map of the Eastern Mediterranean, with which we're more familiar because of what's going on today, the refugee crisis and the war in Syria. But before migrations made it to the world's radar, they were happening in another part of the Mediterranean, the central Mediterranean, but also the Western Mediterranean. And the crossing of the Strait of Gibraltar, which is showing here on the screen, is often gauged by prospective migrants by way of the 14 kilometers that separate Morocco from Spain. This distance is frequently mentioned in literary and filmic narratives. Sometimes the number appears on the first page, the very first page of the literary account, as is the case in the novel Leaving Tangier, which I will discuss later. At other times, it gives the title to the production, as in the Spanish film 14 Kilómetros. The distance is usually minimized because prospective migrants can see the Spanish coast from Morocco. In fact, the Strait, which appears on Roman maps as a great river, is often equated to a moat by those who cross it today. And I will elaborate the latter notion in this paper, this talk in a few minutes. As the opening credits indicate, this scene, which we just watched, is placed at the very beginning of the 2008 award-winning film Return to Hansa, made by Chus Gutierrez, a female Spanish director. This is an important production in its peculiar focus, which is announced right from the start. The drowning is shot from the perspective of the drowning, pulling us in, thus inviting us to experience the plight of the character. As a consequence, it stands in stark contrast to the mass media coverage we have come to see for several years now, in which individuals are replaced by numbers and figures, lumped together into groups and masses, hordes and mobs, threatening to invade the European coasts. As a matter of fact, mass media is embedded in the film, and the mise en abîme permits the filmmaker to comment on this mass media narrative. Indeed, in one scene, we see a family watching dead migrants on a beach, being photographed and filmed by the local news, and the reactions of Moroccan viewers to the death of their fellow citizens being commented on by a Spanish newscaster.
Siguen apareciendo cadáveres en las costas argentinas como consecuencia del trágico naufragio de una patera ocurrido a primera hora de la mañana. En esta ocasión han sido 17 los cuerpos encontrados en la conocida playa de Getares. Nos lo cuenta desde allí nuestra enviada especial,
At the end of the film, another take on the danger of mediatic erasure of migrant subjectivity is provided as the final credits unfold in the form of numbers and headlines extracted from the media appearing on the screen. And I'll show a little excerpt. The long list ends with 36,5, which is the temperature in Celsius of all healthy humans, thus indicating the importance for the filmmaker of restituting a humanistic perspective to dehumanizing depictions of migrants. As Gutierrez explained in a televised program about forced migration, its pull factors, asylum, and the handling of newcomers. Muertos, centenares, interceptados, irregulares. All of these are only words. Everyone has a story. In my talk, I will tackle literature and cinema mostly in broad strokes because I do not have the time necessary to look closely at scenes from films and discuss passages from novels. My goal today is to scrutinize the importance of language, both as vernacular and discourse in general, and how we talk about migration and refugeeism in particular, with a special focus on the puzzling linguistic and discursive framing of these notions as they pertain to recent human migratory movements originating in the Global South. Literature and cinema are both languages in their own right, and they use a language of their own. Fictional accounts are mediums, in other words, transmitters, just like language, and have their rhetoricity, style, and tools to address questionable portrayals and redress biased visions. Film and literature often serve as mirrors to reflect and reflect upon serious matters portrayed in other realms as sub-issues, pre-issues, post-issues, or non-issues. In this presentation, I'm interested in the following nexus: politics/ethics and poetics/aesthetics, and why and how the latter dyad comments upon the former. Many writers and directors have reacted to established portrayals of migrants and refugees and created alternative narratives meant to highlight the illogicalities of the official ones. In this presentation, I will tackle some of the issues that have prompted filmmakers and writers to engage with highly debatable mainstream depictions. I will read passages from my primary and secondary sources in their original languages and will project the translation on the PowerPoint. I do so in order to keep the original meaning of the writer's thoughts intact, for translations can always modify them to some extent. The act of writing on this tragic subject is a militant decision, as these authors have themselves indicated when asked about their choice to delve into the topic. Yusuf Emin Lailani explains that in Sea Drinkers, which is the first Moroccan novella on the topic, he felt obligated to fill in the gap in disinforming news reports such as those that dilute bodies, identities, tragedies, and personal stories, as in Une si jolie petite plage, the title of a news article which Lailani embeds in his novel using the same technique as Gutiérrez in her film, as a way to invite us to dissect the media's incongruous take on the issue at hand. Salim Jaï, another Moroccan writer, argues that the catchy headline, Grosse prise de la Marine nationale en Méditerranée, prompted him to write Thou Shalt Not Cross the Strait. Leila Al-Alami, a fellow citizen known for award-winning books like The Moor's Account and Other Americans, posted on her blog her reason, and I quote, "The news was relegated to the bottom of Le Monde's online page. 15 Moroccan immigrants had drowned while crossing the Strait of Gibraltar on a fishing boat. I read the article from my desk in Los Angeles. I was immediately drawn to these immigrant stories." One could argue that more recent narratives were written as a response to contemporary tragedies. I'm thinking, for example, about Jenny Erpenbeck's Ying Ingegangen and Bodo Kirchhoff's Widerfahrenes, released in 2015 and 2016, respectively. Interestingly, in Erpenbeck's book, the Mediterranean is redefined not as the aforementioned river, but as a lake, which happens to be sometimes used in some contexts as a homonym of sea in German, as is exemplified in this excerpt. Der Mann, der unten in See liegt, haben sie immer noch nicht gefunden. Kein Selbstmord, sondern beim Baden ertrunken. Seit diesem Tag im Juni liegt der See still da. Tag für Tag still. Juni still. Juli still. Und jetzt, bald ist schon Herbst, immer noch still. Kein Ruderboot, keine kreischenden Kinder, kein Angler. Wenn in diesem Sommer irgendwer vom Steg der öffentlichen Badestelle einen Kopfsprung ins Wasser macht, kann es nur ein Fremder sein, der von dem Unglück nichts weiß. I indeed find this parallel between the drowning of a man in a lake and the drownings in the Mediterranean Sea interesting and fascinating, and that due to the fact that Germany does not border the Mediterranean, the author uses a savvy literary stylistic device to make a sea that is hundreds of miles away resonate with her readers. In my discussion of film and literature, I'm referring very briefly to two works that predate the so-called Refugee Crisis. These are Return to Hansa and Leaving Tangier, produced in 2008 and 2006, respectively. In including pre-Refugee Crisis literary and cinematic works, as I examine the situation known as the Refugee Crisis, attributed to a time frame closer to the present, I reject the assumption that the two periods are distinct. I argue instead that the refugee crisis is the culmination and fresh stigmatization of a long era of clandestine crossings taking place through the same region and across the same sea, as is exemplified, in the novel that I will touch upon briefly and the film with which I opened my talk. To analyze the refugee crisis in and of itself risks implying that it is an occurrence that did not have its roots in the decades that preceded it, or rather that it is inscribed in a singular moment, whereas in actuality, it is a continuation and exacerbation of an ongoing situation. In other words, analyzing the refugee crisis without making a connection with previous decades assumes the existence of three independent periods: a pre-refugee crisis, the crisis itself, and its aftermath, each historically distinct and detached from the other two periods. The contemporary tragic events in the Mediterranean and the increasingly stringent anti-immigration policies that ensued have prompted recent literary and cinematic works, but there have been fictional narratives on the topic for decades now, long before what we have come to call the refugee crisis. Indeed, many years of literary, cultural, and artistic productions have centered around the notion of a homicidal sea in which the maritime matrix ceases to fulfill its nurturing nature and instead increasingly fits the profile of a mare mortis, a liquid body filling with murdered bodies. Its weapon is a network of anti-immigration policies, police, and practices that turn innocent lives propelled by their dreams into lifeless fish caught in nets. Literary accounts have commonly commented upon hegemonic discourse and media treatment, as well as bringing aspects of migration, refugeeism, and anti-immigration policies to the attention of a wider audience. For the reader of the presence, for example, in Tahar Benjelloun's novel Partir, published in 2006, translated into Leaving Tangier, the narrator informs the reader of the presence of an ultra-sophisticated civil system put in place on the Spanish coasts to curb clandestine migration from Morocco, focusing on its artillery and murderous nature. L'article racontait que l'Espagne venait très récemment d'installer le long de ses plages un système de surveillance électronique avec infrarouge, armes automatiques, ultrasons, ultra-tout. Since the 1990s, a growing body of works focusing on the maritime journey has emerged in various languages. Leaving Tangier is a piece of what I have called illiterature, namely literary productions that tackle the attempted clandestine crossings of the Mediterranean Sea. I attribute this coinage in literature to three main traits. First, the genre often includes one or more characters who are ill before, during, or after the crossing, or the attempted crossing. Two, it is almost exclusively dominated by male writers. In French, il is the masculine personal pronoun, and the narratives continue to feature a majority of male migrants. And three, plots portray the global south as an island. Île in French is an island where, this is an island where individuals must be confined just as convicts and political threats were in the past exiled, exilés, in short, banished to islands. In so doing, they are kept at bay from a European construed as a fortress. Today's literary productions are recounting the sea passage, and those that predate the refugee crisis are all part of this category of illiterature. In the case of unprecedented human migrations, the historical appellations for the Mediterranean Sea across languages, Mare Nostrum, El-Bahar al-Abyad al-Mutawassit, and La Grande Bleue, for example, continue to find currency, but none of them convey the tragic dimension of this entity. Traditionally viewed as the most frequented sea in the region, the Mediterranean could well be nicknamed the Deadly Sea. Until recently, the Mediterranean has been depicted in scholarship chiefly in a romanticized fashion as a cradle of civilization and a site of passage and exchanges. But in fact, the sea has grown into a cemetery and well before the advent of what we have come to call the refugee crisis, which commentators date back to 2015, but for several decades prior, maritime death occurring in the Strait of Gibraltar were already covered by Spanish and Moroccan media. Contrary to widespread belief, those drownings and capsizings are part of the so-called refugee crisis. In this slide, the refugee crisis is shrouded with misunderstandings, misinformation, and misnomers. A crisis constitutes a flared-up situation usually conceived as temporary. Crisis designates an emergency, but once again, these tragedies have been occurring for several decades, and thus the state of emergency has existed for much longer than is usually implied. Or does the word choice suggest that the phenomenon has reached its highest point? But how can we be sure? For we do not have the necessary hindsight to determine whether this may or may not be the case. Or does crisis simply indicate that Europe is facing a serious situation? The term crisis is viewed as negative, and it certainly is for those who sacrifice their lives in their attempt to make it across to Europe. However, the expression has been used in mass media and politics to convey the impression that it is Europe that it has been the victim of this tragedy. Indeed, the now accepted statement, which has become a consecrated expression, is that this phenomenon is, and I quote, Europe's biggest humanitarian crisis since World War II, end of quote. The Eurocentric emphasis bluntly discounts the well-known fact that the most affected countries are in the Middle East. Additionally, the refugee crisis has often been named the migrant crisis by the very same sources, a conflation that is problematic and that their equivalence minimizes what sociologist Helen Fine calls the universe of obligation, which reinforces Europe's duty to welcome refugees as laid out in the United Nations 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol. Because language both shapes and reflects our conceptualization of the world, it is crucial to tap into vernaculars in order to better understand clandestinity. It is all the more important to do so since politics and mass media have institutionalized interpretations of the phenomenon through repeated use of a fabricated terminology, which has become the default tool for comprehending a certain reality. Hegemonic discourse is never impartial, for it serves interests and is therefore biased and flawed. Migrants and refugees are often attached to the seascape and conflated with the fish that live in it or are washed dead upon the Spanish shore. As Ines Dors aptly demonstrates, the use of a lexicon pertaining to the practice of fishing has a dehumanizing effect. And I quote her, "In Northern Africa, the appellation tuna has come to designate those who try to cross the Strait of Gibraltar. And the attempt to reach the Spanish coast aboard rickety boats is known as to go like tuna." End of quote. The terminology reflects a specific shift in the political arena, which indeed has affected the way people travel, and by the same token, the way others perceive them, or don't, or do, but not the way they should, by means of an insidious process which Césaire named thingification. In examining pervasive rhetoric, it is important to look at alternative narratives that originate in the lives of those whose language allows a settled recounting of their experience and which contrasts with propaganda that inscribes the phenomenon of migration as an evil act with negative effects. One should start with language, since narrative builds upon language. There exists in Arabic an expression conveying the crossing of the sea, to cut the sea, qata'a al-bahr. It should be noted that in spite of the seemingly brutal nature of the image, cutting the sea points to regular and state-sponsored crossings across or over the Mediterranean in the case of plain voyage. In North African societies, this is a linguistic rendition of ferry ships cutting waters on their way back and forth, mostly between Algeria and France, but also Morocco and Spain, before Europe strengthened its external borders, prompting dinghies and inflatable boats to take over in the shadow of patrolling military ships. Cutting the sea connotes a successful passage, the same way as traverser la rue, atravesar la calle, traverser la rue in French, atravesar la calle in Spanish, or die Straße überqueren in German implies a successful endeavor. Indeed, when we say that someone has crossed the street, it wouldn't occur to us that the person was stopped in their attempt. The same applies to the expression to cut the sea. Burning, from the Arabic hariq, is a term in circulation in the Maghreb to signify unauthorized migration. Burning the sea is a linguistic collage which I borrow from the Arabic to burn the road in order to address the specific crossing of the sea. It expresses the act of leaving everything and everyone behind for the northward journey in the context of closed borders. It evokes the vivid image of desperate individuals attempting to do away with the sea, which is seen as an impediment, by drying the Mediterranean with their burning desire to make it to the other shore. Prior to the departure, would-be trans-Mediterranean hopefuls destroy or burn their identification documents in order to avoid repatriation should they be caught. From hrig, fire, comes haraga, those who burn, a term that is now in use in various languages, including Spanish and French, and designates individuals who cross borders clandestinely. While this term has been employed for decades to refer to those who cross the Mediterranean from North African shores, it could also be applied to individuals crossing the sea from the Middle East and the Levant, fleeing geopolitical catastrophes and war, leaving behind their cities and countries consumed by disaster and destruction. Indeed, both groups cross the same sea, are headed to the same continent, and use similar modes of transportation. A large majority of them are Arab and or Muslim, and all undertake the passage clandestinely. Although once again, the distinction between refugee and migrant is crucial in the legal realm, and I would invite you to listen to the conversation that Nathalie Portes, a fellow at the American Academy, had yesterday about this term, and among other things, but she did an excellent analysis of these terms and their differences in what they mean. Again, the distinction between refugee and migrant is crucial in the legal realm, but the term haraga allows us to step outside the unnecessary dichomatization when the phenomenon is addressed from a humanistic, pragmatic, and empirical perspective. Furthermore, to privilege non-Western logos helps prevent essentialization and the rendering of the plight of haraga in obsolete or inadequate terms. By contrast, the use of terminology rooted in the language of the individuals in question helps us better understand the phenomenon from a Southern perspective and lived experience. South of the sea terminology, which is oftentimes self-assigned to express the simple fact of desperate fleeing humans who do not see themselves and their actions in categories, is not only useful but crucial. The Mediterranean is a netted entity that lets a happy few go through while preventing most from making it to the other side. Because the Mediterranean is a liquid body barring access to that which lies on the other side of it, it must be conceived as a sieve rather than a simple sea. We continue to witness a particular development reflective of political disagreements where to save and to sieve cohabit. Official discourses have given the federated EU license to turn the sea into an unethical, illegal, and lethal sieve that murders those it purports to save. In some cases, the notion of national, governmental, federal, and institutional hospitality has been adapted to adopt the view that to save is to sieve. This shift or slip in commentary has become part of the EU's lingua franca. Populist principles of far-right parties of various European countries consist of claiming a sieving of outsiders for the sake of saving an alleged monolithic cultural identity on the verge of extinction. Countless headlines covering the Mediterranean drownings and capsizing have contained the word saved, such as these French, Italian, and Spanish articles. So the first one is in French. Réfugiés, 13 991 migrants ont été sauvés par SOS Méditerranée en 2016. The second one is in Italian. Mediterraneo, ecco il pilotti salvamigranti, il perché di una scelta. And the third one is in Spanish. Via Campa embarks and open arms. No, sorry, I'm reading the English. Via Campa se embarca en open arms para salvar refugiados en el Mediterráneo. Let us pause on this last headlines, and in particular on the typo, or rather a missing element that is unfortunate and potentially corroborates many writers and filmmakers' contention that mediatic treatment has become oblivious to the fact that it is covering human lives. Indeed, in Spanish, you indicate the preposition, you include the preposition a in front of your object of discourse if that object of discourse is a human being. In other words, the sentence should have read, Via Campa se embarca en open arms para salvar a refugiados en el Mediterráneo. This omission in this article dealing with an ex-soccer player who volunteered to join an NGO for 2 weeks to help rescue migrants and refugees drifting at sea is likely a slip of the tongue, or in this case, a slip of the finger, but nevertheless participates in the erasure of migrants' humanity in everyday accounts. Put differently, their visibility is wiped out before they even set foot on European soil. The Spanish rescatar, to rescue, is more commonly used than salvar, to save, as is exemplified in many headlines such as the following. Llegan a Galicia los primeros refugiados rescatados por el Aquarius. The fact that individuals and NGOs from Christian majority countries are portrayed as saving Haraga by fishing them out of water cannot but recall the spiritual imagery of baptism and salvation. Does this image register with religious individuals? And if so, to what extent does it account for their positionality in the ongoing debate about saving versus seething? De facto, this image presents the viewer with his religious duty, as suggested by Pope Francis, who urged help for refugees, a gesture that has, according to some interviewed saviors, prompted them to answer the call. In my work, I have often resorted to neologisms such as illiterature that I mentioned before. My reasoning for doing so is as follows. I contend that words that become concepts, such as the Mediterranean, can be incomplete, misleading, or outright false in their referential aspect. Indeed, the Mediterranean does not mean the same thing for everyone, the same thing in all languages, the same thing at all times, and the same thing in all circumstances. Neologisms maneuver around common misconceptions in that they are not solidified in established usage. Consequently, neologisms permit one to tackle a concept from a new angle and shed light on an aspect that another word does not. With the coined term seametery, I approach my objective study with the idea that the Mediterranean I examine is one in which death and sea are intrinsically linked. In doing so, I adopt a perspective that extricates itself from a strictly Western point of view, which has been dominant in the treatment of the refugee crisis. Indeed, academic discourse has mostly been Eurocentric, with a focus on the impact of the crisis on Europe exclusively, and in terminology that is essentially European. The inclusion of a non-Western standpoint is not meant to compete with, but rather to complete available scholarship. In fact, not only does my approach take a step sideways from a strictly Western point of view, it also adopts a Southern perspective that is missing and necessary, comprised in the unpacking of the neologism to which I will get shortly. Non-Western and coined terminology that encapsulate local specificities, linguistic, representational, cultural, etc., which must be examined, are essential tools to gain a holistic knowledge of a global phenomenon deeply rooted in local idiosyncrasies. Seametery is a neologism meant to render the oxymoronic nature of the sea, in which liquidity has become synonymous with immobility, precipitated by rigid policies that have transformed a sea into a cemetery. A cemetery is a human construction. The site of death and the site of the dead must be kept at bay. Interestingly, cemeteries are often built on the outskirts of cities due to increasingly stringent and deadly anti-immigration policies being put in place. The EU is actively participating in the construction of a cemetery at its margins. The geographic margin of the federated entity known as the EU happens to be the Mediterranean Sea. Fortress Europe is surrounded by a moat that acts as a safeguard against the unwelcome other. Coincidentally, in Arabic, moat means death. The maritime cemetery is also a cemetery in that it is a sea of scenes. The two types of unmatched Mediterraneans bump against each other, and the scene is disjointed and dialogical, with one side of the sea being associated with certain ideas and ideals like peace and wealth, while the other is associated with war and death. With the contemporary militarization of the Mediterranean Sea, for the global north, it is a sea to patrol and control. For the global south, it is a sea where stiffening anti-immigration policies stifle Harraga to death. By their northward journeys, Harraga are enacting a symbolic but rejected attempt at stitching. Just like the expression burning the sea, cemetery is purposefully oxymoronic in that it contains a contradiction in migration politics for Muslim countries. Islam's original historical moment around which a whole set of understandings has evolved is Prophet Muhammad's migration from Mecca, which he fled due to persecution in order to seek refuge in Yathrib in 622. This moment that started the Muslim calendar and gave a city the name of the first refugee of the Muslim community. Yathrib was later renamed Medina, which is short for Medinat al-Nabi, the city of the Prophet, is a crucial element in comprehending migration and refugeeism in Muslim societies. In sum, the Prophet's city is not the one he was born in, but the one he settled in after hardships back in Mecca. With this historical background in mind, migration is not perceived as a negative undertaking, but rather quite the opposite, a path to follow. According to a hadith is a saying attributed to the Prophet, the Ummah, or community of believers, was ordered, and I quote, seek knowledge even if all the way to China, end of quote. Although this phrase can be read as a call to make every effort to educate oneself, it could also be interpreted as a religious call to travel. If Muslims apply this hadith by migrating to Europe instead of China, it is because at the time of the revelation, China was considered the center of knowledge. Today, it is the West that is seen in this light. It should be noted that this hadith is framed as a command. Consequently, in the context of stiffening borders, a long, trying, and perilous journey is the only gateway or way to a gated Europe for many Muslims to fulfill this religious obligation. To conclude, the recent tragedies have shown that from a simple sea to a complex CIVE, which is again the integrated system of external surveillance, el sistema integrado de vigilancia exterior in Spanish, the geophysical maritime border is used as a sieve by Fortress Europe. Presenting itself as saving the lives of the weakest, the EU also plays the role of the survival of the fittest. It plays by the rule, of the survival of the fittest. It faces multiple challenges and dilemmas, namely to sieve or save Harraga, to chase smugglers, or to chastise rescuers. with its operational system that reaches the shores of Africa and beyond, like a net cast onto the sea and bordering cities. The big fish it catches have little hope of welcome or salvation. The Mediterranean Sea is a massive mass grave because migration politics rely on a set of contradictions and illogicalities that provoke desperate acts and untimely ends. A mass grave is a place where the victims of the war are buried. As I had argued, Abderrezak fit the profile. The furrows that military ships and makeshift boats create at the surface are one form of wake. However, this term has other implications for the Mediterranean Seametery. A wake also refers to keeping vigil, as Fortress Europe does with its cive and other methods. But the verb to wake also means to alert. Literature and cinema, fiction as well as nonfiction and documentaries have attempted to bring about a state of awareness or a warness, so to speak. In other words, the war at sea. Still have various other sources, including journalists. In light of ongoing drownings and wreckages, the wake is for the dead that go missing in the wake of ships that crisscross the sea, signaling its nature as sieve and sail. To use the expression of French philosopher Jacques Rancière, Abderrezak fit the profile of sans part, in other words, those of no account, or an indistinct mass of people of no position. Hence the importance of bringing awareness to bodies deprived of adequate means to make a case that they have been the victims of concerted intra, and supranational wrongdoing. At a wake, the mourners are left to watch over a dead body, but who can watch those who have perished in the cemetery?
I think you know, it is the tragedy that we're living in, and you've really addressed it on multi levels and multilinguistically. I mean, I feel my questions are very humble. And so what I'd like to do is just maybe ask, I have a few questions, but I see there are some already in the question and answer little box here, so I don't want to take time much from the audience. And if you do have your questions, please type them into the Q&A, and we will try to get to as many as we can. And then if we can't get to everyone's question, we will forward them, of course, to Hakim, and he will be able to answer them at his leisure personally. So, I mean, that's a great feature of Zoom. So my first question, though, is, you know, because as you know, I've worked on this same body of literature for a while, not as extensively as you have, but in the early 2000s, I did some work in Morocco on a lot of these texts. And one of the things that I was very impressed, or not impressed by, but shocked by, was that many of the people who do take the small boats, you know, are literate and are educated. Yet they don't seem to be writing their own stories. For those who do make it, some have made it across, they don't tend to write their own stories. Actually, the only one I really came across was by a journalist, a Tunisian journalist who went undercover, Fouazi Mela, who wrote in 2000, Clandestine Méditerranée, illegal in the Mediterranean. And he just went undercover just to see what the experience was like, to write about it. So the idea of témoignage, or, you know, testimony, isn't so prevalent in this body of work. And I'm just wondering, the authors and filmmakers who are appropriating these stories, do you feel that it is still doing more harm to the direct voice of these people undertaking these dire decisions to cross? You know, are these authors somewhat to blame for sort of stifling the voices and sticking them into these narratives that that do tend to be repetitive and sort of in the same kind of format as we see in a lot of, certainly the films. I just wondered if you could maybe comment or elaborate on that idea.
Yes, thank you very much for this great question, Valérie. This is indeed a very, very important one, and one that must be asked. So I would answer it by, so the question, I mean, one of the questions embedded in your question is, who writes for whom? And I think, yeah, that it is an essential question. I would say that for practical reasons, the high rate of illiteracy, the high cost of books, the fact that libraries don't have a lot of books in the countries that we're talking about, migratory writers write mostly for a European audience. And I would like, I would like to say that it is, in a way, it is sad that the local people do not have the same access to the books. And I would like to say that at the same time, it's a good thing that they are writing for the West, because it is likely to be to have impact on policy making, and it's also likely to be translated into a lot of European languages, and therefore likely to raise awareness more effectively on an urgent and very sad and tragic topic. You made an important point when you talked about the fact that when you mentioned there's a word that that you mentioned, I think it was sticking to the, how if they're sticking the same narrative, sticking the migrants to the same narrative. I like the term very much, because there is some of that too in some of these novels. I said stifling, and I think sticking is a great term. We could also use the term framing, especially for film, because when you have characters in a frame, you put them in a story, you put them on view, but at the same time, there's this idea, framing has at least two meanings, one and its opposite. Another term that I think I would like to mention, which I think is probably relevant, is the term covering. When it applies to journalism, but it also applies to literature. When you cover a story, you tell what it is, you reveal a story, but at the same time, you also cover it. In other words, you cover elements. You don't tell the whole story. So that's, I think, these terms, I think, could be important to tackle the sometimes ambivalence or double edges or double sides, two sides of a story that is told to us. I think there was something else I wanted to. I don't remember if I tackled all the elements of your question.
It's a good start. Why don't we move on to some of the questions from the audience? Again, I won't read names, but I will read your question, or some of them I'll truncate a little bit just for the instances of our time constraints. But we do have one that sort of segs from, makes a bridge with what we were just talking about. This colleague is asking, does illiterature also contain the valence of illiterate? This might suggest that both the fact that many unauthorized crossers have been deprived of an effective education in their countries of origin, and in addition to the idea of Westerners not reading the humanity of clandestine migrants, this is another level of the term illiterature. And this person continues, thus illiterature would be literature of and for the illiterate, and this person is asking what your thoughts would be on that.
Yes, well, thank you for the question, because it is indeed something that I have considered. Actually, I mentioned today three characteristics or three main aspects of illiterature, but there's a fourth one that I actually published about in a couple of book chapters, and this is this notion that was just mentioned, which is illiteracy. It is contained in the term illiterature, and I actually tackled that aspect because I mean, for various reasons. The first one being that some of these migrants are illiterate, others are not. There are a lot of doctors and lawyers and people with very good situations back home that set off to sea, but they could be illiterate in the language of the host country. There's also, I mean, that brings us back to the beginnings of this illiterature. For example, in Italy, it's something that we noticed a lot in Italian literature, where some of these migrants, contrary to the francophone migrants. The francophone migrants, as you said, Valerie, you know, were not able to, I mean, have not produced their own story. It has been told by others. In the case of Italian literature, some migrants have actually provided their story, but not only themselves, but that was done in the form of a collaboration, and mostly with journalists. So, so it's a different situation that kind of reminds me a little bit of the collaboration, even though it's a very different kind, but the collaboration between the American writer Paul Bowles and Mohamed Rabat in Morocco. But in this case, it's, you know, it's migrants going to Italy, wanting to tell their stories, and doing it with the help of a middle person who was a journalist. So so yes, the term, I mean, the illiteracy is an important element that could be tackled in different ways. As I said, you know, it could be that the person is illiterate or illiterate in the language of the host country, or it could, you know, it could be read in different ways, and it's definitely contained in the term literature. Yeah.
And even illiterate of the laws of each country, because they're also very different.
Absolutely, absolutely. It requires a certain reading that
Right.
yeah, that not everybody can have, not even people who you know, who are lawyers in their own country, because there are national laws and national laws. Yeah.
We have another question, and this one also touches a little, somewhat on one question that I had, because of course those of us who are in the United States have very much, you know, our border, our sort of southern border on our minds, as far as many Latin American migrants making the journey across the desert, which is, you know, our Mediterranean, more or less, where people who, you know, it's a desert, mare mortis. This question is, do you know of any research that synthesizes the sieving versus the saving of the Mediterranean Sea and the funneling of Mexican migrants into the Sonoran Desert as a form of so-called deterrence? So this sort of, you know, parallel world, do they have the same strategies as far as, you know, trying to deter migrants from making that crossing? You know, this person would like to know the nature of the actions of those refusing to accept migrants and immigrants. You know, are they similar, you know, similar practices, similar philosophies?
Yeah, well, I'm very lucky. I've had a lot of great questions, and thank you for asking it. Well, it's absolutely, I mean, it's, well, for the first question, I do not know about any research done on sealing versus saving. When I wrote about saving and sealing, at the time I had no other sources that were dealing with the same topic. So I don't know, maybe there have been others after I wrote that book chapter. Yeah, no, I don't know of any others, but the comparison, or the Mediterranean versus Mexican context is, I think, a very important one, because there's a desert south of the two coveted areas. There's the desert, so on both continents, and sub-Saharan Africans have to cross the Sahara before crossing the sea, and even even Algerians or Libyans, some of them have to cross the desert to get to the sea. So the parallel is well-founded, and another parallel could be drawn because since the 1990s, the Mediterranean has been associated with the Rio Grande in academic discourse, and not only academic discourse. It was this notion was developed by people like Ruffin, Cortese, there was Ruffin, Cortese, King, and Montanari. And it's circulated widely in newspapers and political debates on European migration. So what is fascinating is that we have two similar geographical and economic spaces conceptualized with a common frame of reference. So there is, I mean, the comparative examination of migratory flows, I don't want to use a term flow, so I'll take it back, of migratory human movements in these two spaces can be very useful to better understand what is happening, and therefore what is likely to happen in the future, because it's important to keep in mind that that what happens on the periphery of a geopolitical entity affects this entity, and even more by extension other entities as well. We have seen this with the refugee crisis, which has impacts on a large portion of the world. And these spaces on both continents are two open sky labs, if I may say so, full of lessons. But unfortunately, we often consider these migrations as an evil that must be remedied, as occurrences that must be that are temporary, and that will not, continue to happen in the long run. And as you said, these, I mean, well, actually, I mentioned in my talk today that there is a religious reason for Muslims to travel, which obviously does not apply to Latin America, but and there's also confinement, which I did not have the time to talk about. This pressure exerted by the European Union on North African countries to keep people away from Europe. There's also the Hogra, which is very close to Harga, semantically and phonetically, which is a type of institutionalized societal humiliation that pushes people to leave their country. But for both regions, we have unstable governments. We have economic, societies that do not well economically, and therefore we have a similar phenomena. And I think it would be very interesting to actually compare them. I know of studies that discussed the US-Mexico border, and of course I know studies about the Mediterranean, but I don't know that, that there are a lot of studies that actually discuss these particular points that have been mentioned. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, unfortunately, we have time just for one more question. And so I'm going to ask this one because I think it is a really important one. How do you gender the Seametery? What role does gender play not only in decolonizing Northern narratives on clandestine migration, but also in gendering the male-centeredness of ill literature? This is a really important question, and it is interesting. And I know when I was reading a lot of these narratives, again, coming back to the same framework where there was one woman and 7 men, or 9 men and 1 woman, but there was always just one woman in the boat. What are your thoughts on the gendered dynamics of these stories?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. A lot of the, the narratives that were published, especially in the 1990s, feature boats with men and 1 woman. And it happens also in some films. And it kind of corroborates the idea that illiterature is, a genre that has keeps being dominated by male writers, and the same can be said about filmmakers, even though there have been films made by women as well. I think I'll say this before I move on to the other part of the question. I think that one reason why we saw these kind of narratives in the beginning is that there was this conception that only men were leaving their countries because it was seen as something that a woman shouldn't do in some societies, to leave by herself among men. And there was also the idea that the danger was higher for women, and it was especially this notion of potential rape have been tackled in a lot of these narratives, novels and films. And I think, for example, of Terraferma, an Italian film in which a sub-Saharan migrant is raped and happens to give birth to her child in Italy. And to talk about the other aspect of the question, in my reflection on the Seametery, I actually do tackle the gender aspect of the sea, because I mean, I mentioned, I think, just briefly the term matrix, I believe, and I didn't have time to elaborate, and that would take another presentation to discuss this in detail. But the Seametery has much to do with the idea of a universal womb that ceases to nurture the people around it, or the people that cross it, precisely because it has been militarized. And of course, the military is associated in the universal unconscious as being a male thing. And so I do tackle the importance of language, of gender, sorry, in these types of narratives that deal with the Seametery, and I'm happy to answer more in by email if need be, of course.
Well, I'm sure you will have some emails coming your way. There are a few other questions, and unfortunately, yes, I do apologize for not being able to get to them. This topic is so engaging that I'm sure we could discuss it another hour, but I see that Barrett is back on, giving us the high sign that we must conclude. So I thank you very much, Hakim, for letting me engage with you on this subject. And I thank everyone in the audience who came, many of our friends and colleagues from many years. So thank you so much for being present with us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Valerie, and thank you everyone for attending today. Thank you. It was a great pleasure.
Well, the pleasure was all ours, Hakim. Thank you so much for an excellent presentation, and thank you, Valerie, for being part of the evening and doing such a great job in moderating. I am in a very good position that I can just go down and see you in the library, Hakim, and continue the discussion, which is great. For everyone else, if you want to tune back in at our next event, that will take place tomorrow in the evening, and John Connolly from the University of Berkeley will talk about a history of Eastern Europe. So see you all very soon. Thank you both, Hakim and Valerie. Bye-bye.